is a Metro Talk, an initiative by Metropolis, the World Association of the Major Metropolises, in collaboration with its partners.
Hello everyone and welcome to this third Metro Talk. Today we'll be speaking about the transition towards a new, inclusive and sustainable urban planning. For these discussions, we are happy to have with us William Cobet, Director of Cities Alliance, and Jane Weru, Executive Director of Akiba Mashinani Trust from the Kenya Federation of Slum Dwellers. Thank you, Billy. Thank you, Jane, for joining us to this Metro Talk. I think the current pandemic has confronted us to many of the challenges that we already knew about urbanization, or maybe not only the challenges, but the failures of the current urbanization around the world, especially in the global south. We have the feeling as well in Metropolis that it has deepened some of the inequalities that we already have there. Inequalities in terms to access to public space, access to social basic services, access, for example, to water and sanitation, the digital divide, and so on. As well, we have the feeling that some of the measures that were promoted from global organizations were more like a global north driven. When you were talking about staying at home, all the issues about health and being issues about health and sanitation were taken into account only, I have the feeling, the reality of northern cities and not southern cities. Do you have the same feeling?
Let me start off, Octavi. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm not sure if this is purely a north and south affair, because in many of the cities in the north, and I'm currently telecommuting from the UK, you see the same divide between poor communities and those and who cannot follow all of the advice that is given by COVID-19. I do think there's a specific case in countries in the global south, in Africa and in Asia, and that is, of course, what we can call informal settlements or slums, where you've got people. There's number one, there's no state support. There's no safety net that is provided from the fiscus to protect people in the way that we see in welfare states in the north and even in countries like the United States. And the second is wash your hands is the most important lesson we've all learned. For many people, access to clean, potable water on a regular basis is what they've been fighting for so many years. And so your central premise, which is that the pandemic has shown up and made very stark gross inequalities within our cities and within our societies, is self-evident. And the question, of course, all becomes is what is going to be the reality post-COVID? Is the old normal going to return? And so far, I don't think we've seen enough signs that there is going to be the kind of decisive change that we need, because post-COVID, the inequalities remain. That's the challenge.
That's interesting that you said, because this idea that you don't see that there are going to be, that's your feeling, if I've properly understood, that there are not going to be huge changes then because there's a lot of discussion about the way we were approaching urbanism, the way we were approaching urban planning, the way we were designing our cities. We have realized it was not the proper one, probably, in terms of, as I said before, the design of public space, the different uses of public space, informality. We have realized, even in the north, that we have realized that there was informality as well, and how many people are depending on informality, the issue of commuting and mobility. So are you saying that, and then there was a lot of discussions, we need to rethink mobility, we need to rethink public space. And if I properly understand it, you think that you don't see there are going to be many changes right now, or huge changes?
Well, I think we have to push for changes and continue to push. One of the results in a lot of the economies in countries like Kenya or Ghana or Liberia, where we work, is the institutions and the budgets of these countries are going to be weakened during the course of COVID-19, and so there's going to be and even greater pressure on public resources post-COVID-19. But I would say that COVID-19 just makes sharp policy decisions that were needed to be taken beforehand and will be even more pressing to be taken afterwards. And this is the challenge of making sure that our cities are planned and managed in a way that addresses the entire city and all residents. And, you know, the key point that I really want to make is that the policies that lead to people being overcrowded on dangerous land without services is first and foremost, it's a conscious decision whether to service or not to service. It's not purely the lack of resources, because where there are resources in each of the cities, seeing where those resources get allocated is the real test, and they don't get allocated to what are called, and I use the language myself, informal areas. If you live in those areas, there's nothing informal about your life. That is your daily life.
Absolutely.
And the message to the mayors is that is your city. And that's your starting point, not wishing that they weren't there, but accepting that they are there and starting from that reality.
That's a very good point, because when we talk about informal settlements or slums, true that many mayors, in fact, they will be willing not to have them there, but that's the reality. And that's, as you say, it's not informal lives, it's real lives living there. So Jane, do you think that the current situation has forced, and building on what Billy is saying, has forced local governments to really confront this reality and to accept that they have this reality in their own cities and they need to take measures? Because I think it's true that many times in the discussions, I see what Billy says, that sometimes we think it's an issue of resources, but what Billy is introducing here is the need of willingness, no? The willingness and leadership in terms of sorting out these situations. So what are your views, Jane? I think your microphone is off.
Yeah, sorry, I think I've unmuted. Thank you. I think what Billy said is very correct, that it is not always a question of a lack of resources. Sometimes it is almost a conscious decision that cities make not to provide basic services to the people that need them the most. So for instance, here in Kenya, we find that our laws in our city, our Nairobi city laws, provide that the water companies cannot, the water utilities cannot provide water and sewer services to people who do not have title documents. Now, the reality is that the poorest people in the city live at squatters on land that is not titled. So that means that the poorest cannot access water and sewer services. And what this means is that the poorest are often put at the mercy of cartels who come in and steal water from the utility and then reticulate it and sell it at costs that are often 10 times more than the ordinary person pays within the city. So it is not that the resources are not there. The resources are there, but there is a conscious decision, a policy decision that says that the utility companies cannot provide water and sewage services to the city, to the poorest who live in informal settlements. So one of the things then that has shown up during this period is that of this COVID period is the interconnectedness of the city, and that COVID does not know boundaries. The COVID pandemic doesn't know that there are informal settlements that are not going to be provided water by the utility, and that they're high-end areas that have more water often than they need. They have water for washing cars, or the others don't even have water for flashing, don't even have a toilet. So what this has shown is that cities cannot afford to have areas that are public health hazards, because issues of public health are the basis upon which a city stands or falls. If a city does not take care of its basic public health, does not meet the minimum requirements of public health, it cannot hope to prosper. And that is what is becoming very clear. And so in Nairobi and here in Kenya, I can see that the local government, the Nairobi Metro area government, has decided to provide basic services to all informal settlements in the city to respond to this demand by declaring informal settlements as special planning areas that should be given priority in the areas of planning and provision of basic services. Sorry.
No, sorry. It's really, it's very interesting what you're saying, and as well this idea of interconnectivity, how you have realized that, and it links with what Billy was saying, that some mayors and some leaders, local leaders, think that, well, slums are not there because they are informal, they are not there. But then you talk about the interconnectivity. So their reality at the end of the day is there, so you need to acknowledge their reality. So how, in terms of planning, how you take into account this interconnectivity? And then there is the second question would be in terms of governance, because normally, as you were talking about the metro area of Nairobi, but in many metro areas, you have different local governments and even national government, regional governments overlapping. So you have to have this interconnectivity of policies and planning, but as well this interconnectivity of local governments and other authorities. How do you see the approach of interconnecting all these levels? I don't know, Jane or Billy.
I think we've lost Jane's picture for the moment.
Yeah.
I come back to the interconnectivity point because I think this is one just worth ramming home, which is that the wealthy in a given city, it can be in Nairobi, it can be elsewhere, believe that they can sort of separate themselves from the poor and not worry about the consequences of no water sanitation. They can't hide with COVID-19, and that has sort of like it's metropolitan. It's given a metropolitan flavor. It's given a citywide flavor to the pandemic, and I hope driven home the message to the policymakers that that's exactly how they should be looking at their city. And so I think there's a couple of key elements, because the planning tools, Octavi, are not particularly difficult. What seems to be so difficult is the ability to make the decision and to allocate the resources. So a couple of key elements. In most cities which have rapid urban growth in Asia, in Africa, and as we saw in Latin America, it is the functioning of the urban land market that is very often the first challenge. Jane's indicated that one local authority says if you don't have title, you don't get services. I mean, but people without title cannot survive without water or sanitation. And so all that happens, and this is the consequence that the public authority needs to consider, is they force the creation of a parallel market. So people will access land, they will access water and sanitation, but they will do so. And the rule that plays out in city after city is that the urban poor pay more per unit of service in the same city than do the rich. And so it's actually very expensive to be poor if you're buying water. The cost is up. So
that's quite shocking. And this is related to the land tenure or having titles of property. Is it related to that, you think?
Partially. It's related to the language of formal and informal. So even if people live in what are called informal settlements, mm-hmm. The weakness is it's still the obligation of the local authority to formally treat them as urban citizens and to provide services and to share the cost of providing that services with all residents of that city. This is why I emphasize always citywide. You've got to plan for the whole city. You cannot treat the poor areas as a special project and ring fence their finances. So the big challenges in my mind are two. One is citywide planning, and the second is planning for the future so that you don't get caught up in the traps of the past. And most governments are very reluctant to plan for urban growth. That is certain, it is predictable. And instead of planning for the next 12 months, city governments should be thinking about how their city is going to change in the next 20 to 30 years, and what steps they should be taking now to protect the interests of all residents of the city and its contribution to the national economy. Again, very easy to say, not difficult to do, but it's that break in the decision making that what Jane's saying seems to have happened in Nairobi, where there's now a conscious decision to prioritize, which means getting up to normal areas through the special planning areas legislation, which I find fascinating.
No, we go back again to the issue of willingness, no? The political willingness and political leadership. And as you said, more or less, it's difficult to make this shift in terms of, you don't only need to think in terms of your 4 years mandate, 5 years mandate, but think ahead 20 years, 25 years, and how you project your city, and your city take into account all the realities, as well the informal realities. I don't know if Jane is there, because I would like to connect that the discussion, but always we'll leave there. The question is how as well, which kind of initiative based from the communities that can help to push for this approach of, because as well, I think it's difficult, I suppose, when you are on your everyday basis, when you have needs to sort out as well, to push for structural changes in your city. So how can you handle as well as a community all to push for these changes? I don't know if Jane is connecting.
Yeah, can you hear me? I
yes.
Can't, my video link has disappeared, so I'm sorry for that.
So, no, what I'm asking, I wanted to know from you as well, from the perspective of the communities, because we're discussing about this, how to handle the short-term decisions with the long-term vision and changes and planning. And so from a community-based perspective, how you can handle all these situations, like sorting out the everyday needs, but as well thinking of the future of the city, of the planning in an interconnected way.
Yeah, I think for informal settlement dwellers, for the poor, normally these conversations about planning and special planning areas begin with a real urgent need. And for us here in Nairobi, we started it in a community called Mukuru that was faced with the threat of eviction. And so we started engaging the state on what to do about these eviction threats, because we had about 100,000 households living on 650 acres of land that were all faced with the threat of eviction. And of course, if those evictions were to occur, it would be a major catastrophe for the city. And so we started engaging around that immediate need. But as we engaged, we realized that the problem of this informal settlement, this huge informal settlement, went beyond the issues of insecure tenure. And there were deep systemic issues that needed to be addressed. And so we realized that we could not begin to address those issues without evidence. And so we started collecting and doing research with the community itself so that we could gather evidence. We looked at what existing plans the city already had, because the city did have a plan for the Nairobi area and the metro area, but those plans had not been created with informal settlements in mind. And so this planning process enabled us to link the city, because informal settlements normally are not even linked to the rest of the city through the existing plans. So you'll find, for instance, that there is a road that exists and has been planned for, but when it comes to an informal settlement, it just dies, or a sewer system. There's no connectivity between that sewer system and the informal settlement. So one of the major issues and one of the major objectives of this plan was to build that interconnectivity between the rest of the city, the plans and the existing infrastructure, between the rest of the city and informal settlements. So that is the way we did it. And like I said, the major mover and driver of this planning process was the people themselves, looking for an immediate response to an immediate problem, but again, looking beyond that immediate problem and developing short, medium, and long-term plans for the redevelopment of their settlements, involving not only themselves, but other civil society actors. So in this case, we work with about 41 civil society organizations and private sector organizations and government agencies. Thank you.
This is really interesting, because it changes the approach. Normally we think in terms of community-based organizations, they only ask and demand things, but what you're sharing with us is a very interesting experience where you produce evidence. So the demands are based on evidence. You have as well a vision of your city, not only of your slum, but a vision of the entire city, and as well you connect and link with other organizations, not only local government, but other organizations around the city and the metropolitan space. So you create complicities as well. I mean, you engage in a new dynamic in terms of designing and thinking the city. Because my feeling is that normally when we talk about informal settlements, maybe something as related to what Billy said before, is from the point of view of some of the citizens that are living in the formal part of the city, and the mayors, when they are planning, they think, well, we need to get rid of slums because they don't look nice, but they don't think in terms of there are people living there, that they have ideas, that maybe they have even solutions. That it's not about removing the slums and the people, but changing the way it's being planned, everything. I don't know if you agree with that, or Billy, Jane.
Yeah, I agree completely, because it's not about moving or removing a slum. It's about appreciating that the people who live there are an essential part of the city. That they're the people who work in the offices of our cities, who work in our homes, who clean our streets, and that they're a crucial and essential elements of the city, and that the city must make provision for them. And what we discovered is that it is not always that the poor are not able to pay. In fact, in many instances, the poor pay more than the rest of us for almost everything. Mm-hmm. And so it is really a matter of the city appreciating that they have a cadre within their cities that are not able to afford the services that are provided by the formal sector, and that they rely on informal services, and then to look at those services that are provided and to ask yourself, can these services be provided in a better way to our poorest in the city and at a better price? Are our poorest getting value for money? And then to work with everyone to ensure that the poorest within the city are getting value for money, because normally they are not, and normally they are paying much more. So that is, I presume, the basis upon which the city of Nairobi decided, one of the main reasons the city of Nairobi decided to intervene through the special planning areas within informal settlements.
That's something, yeah.
I would add plenty, because these are the key points. I mean, and this approach of the special planning authority is modeled, or at least is an echo of, for example, the city statute in Brazil, where they created these special planning areas which allowed for public interventions to try and rapidly change the profile of that part of the city. And so you want an image of the mayor looking at an informal settlement. And so it's perfectly reasonable to say, how do I not get rid of it, but how do I change this? And your mindset becomes different. You say to the mayor, okay, what policy do you need to implement to make the residents here help them to turn this into what you would call a middle class area, or a regular suburb of the city? And then the policy consequences of that flow. But the primary point of departure is it's going to be those residents staying, and it's working with them to make the change. And the real test then becomes with the mayor. I remember saying this at a conference in the Philippines, and I said, that's your middle class in waiting. How do you empower them to become and turn their shacks into homes and to turn what you call a slum into a regular part of the city. That's what happened in London. It what happened in Paris. This is not it's not an African problem. It's not an Asian problem. It's part of the transformation of societies and structural transformation of the economy. But the real challenge for the politicians is not to examine their speeches, is to look at the budget. What resources are being allocated to different parts of the city, and are the priorities correct? And if we just get more transparency about the consumption of resources and the price paid, and I began my career in apartheid South Africa, where we were commissioned by an organization similar to Jane's, a community organization, to look at the financial relationship between Soweto and Johannesburg. Everyone assumed that white Johannesburg was subsidizing black Soweto. And when we got into the detail, and this is a published report, we demonstrated exactly the opposite, that the poor were subsidizing the rich. And I am certain it's the same in most cities in the world. And that's the debate we need to be having, because at the moment, people's poverty is subsidizing others' comfort in the same city. And that's the inequality that we need to challenge.
And that's quite shocking. And so maybe we should also get rid of the word beautifying, if we could say like beautifying the city, which many times this is what's driven some of the changes in planning and in designing the city. Is more about the people and having the people there, not moving people. I think we are running out of time. Jane, I don't know if you want to add some final words and some final reflections to the discussions we were having today. We cannot hear you. I think you have the microphone off.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think it's just to say that in changing the informal situation in informal settlements is not just the work of the people who live there. It's not only the responsibility of the people who live there. It is not only the responsibility of cities and local authorities. It is the responsibility of all the citizens of the city. And cities have a wealth of resources. One of the things that we discovered once we started to look at the SPA is that there were so many organizations that had resources, and not only cash, not only financial resources, but human resources, knowledge, that were ready to give those resources, that knowledge, that time, and the little bit of money that they had in their pockets to make a change for the city. And I think mayors and metro areas should never say that they cannot begin to make a change in informal settlements because they do not have the resources, because the resources are there within their cities. And the first thing that they need to do, or I believe that they could do, is to begin to mobilize the human resource that is within their cities to begin to make a change. And it can be done. And I think it in the long run makes a very big difference within cities when local governments mobilize that resource, that human resource that is there to begin to change our cities.
Thank you. I'm sorry you have run out of time, but I think your words, I think, were perfectly for wrapping up this conversation. Thanks a lot, Billy. Thanks a lot, Jane. You have given us a lot of food for thought. I get some ideas like interconnectivity, that dealing with informal settlements is not only about the people living there, it's about all the people living in the city and all the actors. And these ideas about the balance between short-term and long-term visions in terms of planning. Thanks a lot. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you.